Andrew Adonis, thanks for joining us. Let's talk broadly about this Labour conference, because it looks like we're heading towards a general election in the autumn. You'd think the party bods, the staffers, would want this to be a great platform to launch Labour policies and start talking about that election campaign. And yet we've had an abortive attempt to remove Tom Watson from his role as Deputy Leader, and this afternoon a crunch vote on Brexit and where the party stands on the issue. What's your assessment of things so far?
The only thing that really matters at this conference is what it decides on Brexit. Everything else is essentially irrelevant, and no one is much noticing outside. They never do at party conferences. The reason why the decision this afternoon is so important is it will determine what the party's policy is at the next election. And there are two choices now. One is a straightforward Remain position, that we're in favour of a referendum with an option to remain, and we will campaign to remain. And the other is a 2/3 Remain position, where we'll support a referendum with an option to remain, but we won't say or indeed even decide what our policy is until after the general election and after there's been a further negotiation. Now, the second position I do not believe is sustainable. The idea that Labour could go through a general election campaign without telling people whether it would be remain or leave in a subsequent referendum, I think is just a laughable proposition. I don't think it'll be sustainable. I think if we try to sustain it through an election, it will literally collapse, as did our policy in the European elections where we did the same. So I very much hope that the decision this afternoon is to go for a straightforward, complete Remain position, a referendum with a Remain option, and Labour, led by Jeremy Corbyn, will campaign to remain. If we don't and go for the 2/3 option, I don't believe it will be stable, and I think it will have to be changed before we get to the election. So that's what really matters at this conference. The only other thing that's caused a lot of rumbling that people have noticed outside is, of course, the attempted removal of Tom Watson. Well, that was just stupid. I mean, that is repeating all of the mistakes that Boris Johnson has done, where people who disagree within the party you expel. Labour's a broad church party. If we can't accommodate people with views of Tom Watson as well as views of Jeremy Corbyn, then we don't deserve to be a party of government. What I would just say is that the attempted removal of Tom Watson failed. When Boris Johnson sought to expel his 21, including, let's be clear, including Philip Hammond, former Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Gauke, former Cabinet Minister, Rory Stewart, former Cabinet Minister, and all that, he succeeded. So at the moment, in the situation that we face, where you've got two leaders, both of whom have got parties with, which at the moment are difficult to manage on this Brexit, on this Brexit issue, Boris Johnson is consistently failing in the task of leadership, whereas actually Jeremy Corbyn so far has come through.
So I'd like to pick up there on what you said about Jeremy Corbyn campaigning fully behind Remain, because I think really, if we're honest, that's probably the sticking point, isn't it? Because he's been Eurosceptic for much of his life, indeed the entirety of his life. And I think that's where the conflict now comes, because the party membership here, as we all know, in fact, overwhelmingly in favour of backing Remain. The tension here is the leader, isn't it? The tension here is Corbyn's office and how full-throated they're prepared to be in supporting Remain.
Well, it has been until now, but Jeremy has always been good at embracing a decision and a position once it's been taken. So a year ago, well actually a year and a half ago, we were having a big argument, remember, about whether Labour would support a customs union as our policy. This was long before we moved towards a Remain position. Once we'd adopted that position, Jeremy then absolutely went for it thereafter. Actually, Jeremy now has completely accepted that we're going to have a referendum with an option to remain come what may, whether it's on Boris Johnson's deal, whether it's after a general election, and Labour holds it. Well, a year ago, the big battle at this conference, which I vividly remember, was getting a commitment, which Jeremy wasn't anxious to make, that there would be a referendum with an option to remain. So, as you know, Ollie, I'm a great optimist. I am optimistic that the Labour conference will do the right thing, that Jeremy will embrace it, that he will be God's gift to Remain campaigning in the referendum. But if my optimism doesn't prove well-founded this afternoon, and we don't go in one move straightforwardly to the Remain position, then Lloyd George, great piece of advice: when traversing a chasm, it is advisable to do so in one leap. I think what will happen as people realise what they're doing is leaping into the void in the general election is that we will have to revisit any decision not to go for a straightforward campaign for Remain position, and we'll get there by the general election anyway.
If Labour's position wasn't what you wanted, if it wasn't that straight-out campaign for Remain, could you get behind supposed neutrality in a referendum campaign?
No, of course I couldn't. What I will do if we don't get to the right position this afternoon is, a minute after that vote, I will start campaigning ceasing inside the party to get out the party's position to move fully. Because the party's position, if we are in favour of a referendum, in favour of a Remain option, almost the entire shadow cabinet and our MPs intend to campaign for Remain. Our position will be absurd if our actual policy doesn't reflect that reality. It now needs to reflect that reality. It's only a matter of time before it does, because even if we go with the weak version, which is a referendum with a Remain option, but we don't say until the eve of the referendum what position the party is going to take. In fact, we all know it's going to be Remain. There will be civil war inside this party if it weren't Remain. You've got Emily Thornberry and Keir Starmer who are opening and closing the debate this afternoon. Both of them are now strongly in favour of Labour campaigning for Remain and say that they intend to do so. So to be blunt, is Jeremy Corbyn going to be virtually the only person left in the party who is not going to be coming out and saying that they would campaign for Remain? That clearly isn't viable. Jeremy understands that he has to hold the party together and that this is now the only credible position. And as I say, it's only a matter of time, but it's much better we do it sooner rather than later, so we maximise the advantages of being at the head of the Remain alliance, I believe can now win the next general election.
That's interesting. You mentioned there that Jeremy could be the only person holding that position, and something else that I've noticed in the short time I've been here is the conversation almost about who Jeremy's successor is going to be, and two of those names are Keir Starmer and Emily Thornberry, two people who are very explicit in their support for Remain. Do you think if Jeremy wasn't prepared to move to this position and support Remain as explicitly as a lot of people want him to, do you think that could expedite his time as leader? Do you think we could see him going and being replaced by a stronger Remain voice?
Well, everyone expects a general election imminently. I mean, it could be literally in 2 months' time. It's not going to be long after that. The question, to be blunt, is whether there's a referendum before an election or an election and then a referendum. If the referendum comes before, maybe the general election won't be until early to mid next year. But if the referendum doesn't come soon, and that depends on what happens in Parliament in late October, if it doesn't come soon, then we will virtually certainly move to an early election. Now, I don't think anyone in the Labour Party thinks it would be a good idea, let alone possible, to go into a leadership election before that general election. So we're all one big happy ship. We're going to be behind Jeremy. We go into that election and we fight to win, and we fight to win to stay in the European Union. You know, if Labour is not the party of Remain, which is the overwhelming opinion of people in the Labour Party, because we're not going to build Labour internationalism and social democracy across Europe unless we're all in the European Union together. If we get to that position and Jeremy helps us to deliver it, he could be Prime Minister for a long time.
The Remain alliance you touched on there, presumably that would include the Liberal Democrats, who have said that there's very little chance that they could work with Jeremy Corbyn. We know that their electoral strategy is taking those Tory seats, and so for Jo Swinson to embrace Jeremy is something unlikely, I think, that we're going to see, because it's anathema to those voters that they're trying to win over.
Well, the crucial thing is policy. If the Boris Johnson literally collapses, and we have to form an emergency government next month, which could happen because he says he won't apply for the extension, won't send the letter, and therefore there's a motion of no confidence and he has to resign. If that happens, the critical issue, which again comes back to this issue about is Labour going to support Remain, is would we be able to put together an agreement between the parties for an immediate referendum with a Remain option that only works if that government also supports Remain. You couldn't have a situation where a government led by Jeremy Corbyn enacts referendum legislation with a Remain option, but the Prime Minister himself isn't prepared to say at the outset that he would support that Remain option. So I think actually the ball is much more in Jeremy's court than in Jo Swinson's. If Jeremy makes it clear to the whole of Remain Britain, which is now the majority of Britain and embraces all of the opposition parties, that a Jeremy Corbyn-led government would be for a referendum with a Remain option and will campaign for Remain, then I think that Jo Swinson will, whether she likes it or not, support him. What Jo Swinson obviously can't do is she can't have a veto over the leader of the Labour Party any more than we have a veto over the leader of the Liberal Democrat Party, unless there is a policy issue at stake. If the issue is that in order to get a government that is committed to legislating for a referendum and then campaigning for Remain, that you need a different Prime Minister, well, that's one thing. But if in fact Jeremy's embraced that position, then I don't think it's credible for Joe Swinson to try and tell us who should be leading the Labour Party.
And if the key to unlocking that Remain alliance was an adoption of the Liberal Democrat policy, just straight out revoke Article 50.
Yeah, that's not going to happen. I don't think there's anybody sensible, including most Liberal Democrats, to be frank, who think that given the extent of this crisis and the degree to which it's embraced the public, because of course we had a referendum 3 years ago, that Parliament can just unilaterally revoke Article 50 without there being a referendum or an election where the main issue has been Brexit. But in that election, all of the parties, I think, besides the Liberal Democrats, will say that their commitment is, all of the Remain parties, is to hold a referendum. So I don't think simply saying that the Liberal Democrats would revoke is going to go anywhere at all.
What do you think the consequences would be in the country if we did revoke flat out, no referendum?
Well, it could only happen if the Liberal Democrats won an election outright.
You're saying there's no chance of that happening?
Yellow pigs don't fly, do they?
Andrew Adonis, all eyes on this afternoon. Thank you so much for taking
great
the time.
to see you.
Cheers.
All the best.